I'd like to make an analogy. I have an analogy. And the analogy answers your question, what is my message? What am I trying to propagate here on this channel? The IRS was recently confronted with the evidence that they targeted conservative groups. And a guy named Miller, somebody high up in the IRS, had to testify before Congress. And a legislator from Texas, I forgot his name, questioned him effectively, but got no answers. Said, who, asked this guy Miller of the IRS, who targeted these groups? And Miller says, I object to the word targeted. Nobody was targeted. Well, you are obviously targeting certain groups. Who did it? Who did it? I object to the word targeting. We don't. I'd be shocked if anybody was targeted. Well, obviously they were targeted. Who is responsible for targeting these groups? Who broke the law? Who? I can't tell you right now. We're looking into it. Somebody filed a report, and the report will be out soon, and I really can't say anything more. In other words, Miller evaded the obvious. Obviously, somebody targeted certain groups so that their tax-exempt status as an organization might be denied, or that these groups could be harassed and thwarted in some way because obviously they were politically opposed to the current administration. So this head of IRS, Miller, skated around the obvious. He just dodged the obvious as though he was oblivious to the fact that somebody made the decision and made a plan to target certain groups, and this plan was carried out. But he just doesn't seem to grasp it, that an individual or a group of people did this, and so such a group is impossible to finger. You can't finger somebody that doesn't exist, and you can't accuse them of doing something that they didn't do because nobody targeted anybody. Obviously, see, Miller, in this example, this is my analogy, is avoiding the issue. Well, in my videos that I've made recently, you may learn through a cursory glance of my recent videos the past year, 2 years, 3 years, that I entertain in my head the idea that the solar system is moving through various densities of interstellar medium, which is composed mainly of hydrogen, and that this interstellar medium, this hydrogen, fuels the sun in a sporadic manner, more or less, sometimes almost nothing and sometimes a significant amount, so that the sun, over the course of 1,000 years or 100 years, would slightly brighten and slightly dim according to this fuel that it's able to suck in from these clouds of hydrogen gas, the remnant of a nebula. The obvious is that this gas causes the sun to brighten and dim, and this drives our climate. That's the obvious. The scientists that study this and admit everything that I'm saying, admit the reality of these clouds, admit the reality that the solar system is moving through these clouds, just like Miller of the IRS, just can't even grasp the obvious, or they pretend that they can't grasp the obvious. One scientist by the name of Redfield, whose article is in the Science online magazine called Science, says that a mass equivalent to Mount Everest confronts the heliosphere, an imaginary invisible bubble with the sun in the center and all the planets around it, that a mass equivalent to Mount Everest is confronted by the heliosphere as it moves through this gas. Every day, every 24-hour period, Mount Everest is encountered by the heliosphere. And they admit some of this gets in. And they admit that it's mainly hydrogen. And they admit that, yeah, the hydrogen does get in. Well, does it all get in, or does just some of it get in? Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. Some of it goes around. Some of it, just piles up, in front of the heliosphere like water in front of a boat. We used to say it was a bow shock, and now we say, well, it's not really a bow shock. It's a bow wave, blah, 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 blah. Just like Miller, the IRS, they keep evading the issue. Well, does this hydrogen get in? Well, but they won't even. Nobody asked the question, and so they're not forced to answer a question that nobody's asking them except me. And of course, I can only ask them here on YouTube. Obviously, this hydrogen, clumps of very thin hydrogen, the remnant of an ancient nebula, is affecting the sun, causing it to brighten and dim in accordance with the density and the amount of hydrogen it encounters as it moves. And as they even have a name for all these several clouds through which we are passing and have passed and will pass. But immediately we're in what's called the local cloud. And the next cloud that we will encounter in 1,000 years or so, they call the G cloud. If you admitted the obvious that the climate is driven by these clouds of hydrogen, you'd have ample reason to suspect that man-made CO2 does not drive the climate. Because CO2 has been higher and it's been lower. It's a trace gas, it's minute. And suppose some of it was put into the atmosphere by man. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Maybe the ocean warmed up and this carbon dioxide exhaled from the oceans. And as the climate cools, well, then the oceans will dissolve more carbon dioxide. It fluctuates up and down together with the temperature. Because these two fluctuate together, you can only guess, if you're ignorant, which of the two drives the other. Is CO2 driving temperature, or is temperature driving CO2? Well, obviously temperature drives CO2 because it dissolves in cold oceans and it is exhaled by warm oceans. But the reason this is relevant is that the leftists, the international socialists, and the communists, the dictators, the authoritarian dictators who use communism to manipulate huge groups of people, are trying to convince the world that we must restrict our carbon dioxide output. The consequence of that will only be a crippling and stifling of the economy of the world. And if the United States is targeted by these people the way the IRS targeted conservative groups, the ones who will bear the brunt of this restraint on carbon dioxide will be the industrialized democratic republic democracies, capitalist countries, which are the enemies of this worldwide socialist movement, controlled ultimately by most likely a few dictators, just like the Soviet Union was controlled by a small party, a small group who put forth their leader as a somewhat of a figurehead, whether it be Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Andropov or Gorbachev. So this whole controversy over climate has to do with who's going to take over the world. Who is going to take over the world? Will we be under the thumb of a dictator, or will we be able to enjoy the freedom and prosperity that we've enjoyed during the past couple of 100 years?